In the year 1258, the Mongol army stood before the gates of Baghdad, the House of Wisdom, repository of centuries of human knowledge, was about to burn. Scholars threw priceless manuscripts into the Tigris River, hoping somehow to save them. The river, they say, ran black with ink for days. 800 years later, in Mosul, another library burned. Different conquerors, different reasons, the same story. Welcome to Forgotten Earth. Today, we are going to explore one of history's most haunting mysteries. Not why civilizations fall, but why they fall in exactly the same ways. Why do humans, generation after generation, century after century, walk willingly into the same traps? Why do we ignore the warnings written in our own history? The answer isn't what you think, and understanding it might be the only way we avoid becoming another forgotten civilization ourselves. Let me tell you about a city that no longer exists. In the 3rd century BCE, Alexandria stood as the crown jewel of the Mediterranean, home to perhaps 500,000 people. It possessed the largest library in the ancient world, a lighthouse considered one of the 7 wonders, and a cosmopolitan culture that drew scholars from every corner of the known world. The city thrived on trade, on diversity, on the free exchange of ideas. Its rulers understood that knowledge was power, but also that knowledge must flow freely to create more knowledge. Scientists in Alexandria calculated the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy. They understood the Earth orbited the Sun. They built steam engines, automated theaters, and sophisticated machines that wouldn't be seen again for over 1,000 years. But there was a problem brewing, a problem that the scholars, focused on the stars and mathematics and philosophy, didn't see coming. The economy was changing. The wealth that had built Alexandria came from controlling trade routes. But those routes were shifting. Political power was consolidating elsewhere. And as the money began to dry up, so did the tolerance for expensive pursuits like philosophy and astronomy. Why feed scholars when you could feed soldiers? Why preserve books when you needed bread? By the time the scholars realized what was happening, it was too late. The funding stopped. The great minds dispersed. The library, that magnificent repository of human achievement, fell into neglect when it finally burned, whether by accident or design. Most of the world had already forgotten what was being lost. Now, let me tell you about another city. In the 9th century CE, Baghdad became the intellectual center of the world. The Abbasid Caliphate established the House of Wisdom, drawing scholars from across 3 continents. Here, ancient Greek texts were translated and preserved. Here, algebra was invented, algorithms, advanced medicine, astronomy that mapped the heavens with precision Europe wouldn't match for 500 years. Baghdad thrived on the same principles as Alexandria: cosmopolitan exchange, intellectual freedom, heavy investment in knowledge and science. The caliphs understood that a society's strength came not just from its armies, but from its ability to solve problems, to innovate, to adapt. But then, something shifted. Political instability crept in. Religious authorities began questioning whether all this foreign knowledge was corrupting the faithful. Voices arose saying resources should go to more immediate concerns. The focus turned inward, defensive, protective. By the time the Mongols arrived in 1258, the House of Wisdom was already a shadow of its former glory. When Hulagu Khan's forces destroyed the city, they weren't just ending a place. They were ending an entire era of human intellectual achievement. The pattern is unmistakable. Two civilizations, separated by more than 1,000 years. Different religions, different cultures, different languages, yet they made identical choices that led to identical ends. This isn't coincidence. This is something deeper. Throughout history, civilizations have collapsed in ways that seem almost scripted, as if there's a playbook for societal failure that every culture eventually picks up and follows. Despite all the warnings, despite all the evidence of what happened to those who came before, archaeological evidence and historical records reveal that most civilizations fail along four primary pathways. I call them the four pillars of collapse: environmental degradation, economic inequality, political rigidity, and the loss of collective purpose. Let's explore each one, and you'll see just how many times this story has been told. On Easter Island, the Rapa Nui people developed a sophisticated society. They carved those famous stone heads, the moai, and created a complex culture on one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. For centuries, they thrived, but there was a problem. The island's resources were finite, and the population was growing. The Rapa Nui needed trees for boat building, for moving the moai, for firewood and construction. So they cut them down, and when those were gone, they cut down more. The archaeological record tells us something haunting. As the last trees disappeared, as erosion began destroying the topsoil, as fishing became difficult without proper boats, the Rapa Nui didn't stop building moai. They built more, bigger ones, as if the statues themselves could solve the crisis that cutting down trees to move them had created. By the time Europeans arrived in 1722, the island was nearly barren. The population had collapsed. The survivors lived among the ruins of their ancestors' achievements, unable to explain what had happened or why. Now, you might think, well, that was an isolated island. Surely larger civilizations would be smarter about resource management. Let me tell you about the Maya. The classic Maya civilization flourished in Mesoamerica for over 600 years. They built massive cities in the jungle, developed sophisticated astronomy and mathematics, created an intricate writing system. At their peak around 800 CE, millions of people lived in Maya cities connected by trade routes and shared culture. But the Maya faced a challenge. Their agricultural system required clearing jungle for farmland. The limestone soil of the Yucatan Peninsula was fertile but thin. After a few growing seasons, fields would lose productivity. So the Maya would clear more jungle. For centuries, this worked. The civilization expanded, populations grew. Cities competed to build taller pyramids, more elaborate palaces. Kings sought to outdo their rivals in displays of power and wealth, and then the droughts came. Climate records from lake beds show that between 800 and 1000 CE, the Maya heartland experienced a series of severe droughts. These weren't unprecedented. Droughts had happened before, but this time, the civilization couldn't adapt. Why? Because they'd stripped away the jungle that regulated the regional climate. They'd depleted the soil. They'd grown dependent on a complex agricultural system that had no resilience, no buffer against disaster. Their cities were locked into patterns of competition and display that consumed resources even as those resources dwindled. Within a century, the great Maya cities were abandoned. The jungle reclaimed them. Millions of people died or scattered. An entire civilization collapsed, not because they didn't know deforestation was a problem, but because stopping seemed impossible. The system had its own momentum. The Maya had libraries. They had historical records. They knew about earlier civilizations that had fallen. Yet they couldn't, or wouldn't, break the pattern. This same story plays out again and again. The ancestral Pueblones in Chaca Canyon, who deforested their environment and depleted their water sources while building increasingly elaborate ceremonial centers, the Khmer Empire, whose massive hydraulic works and intensive rice cultivation eventually degraded the very systems that had made them powerful. The ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia, who irrigated their fields so intensively that salt buildup poisoned the soil, turning the Fertile Crescent into a desert each time. The civilization possessed the knowledge to understand what was happening. Each time, they continued anyway. In the 1st century CE, Rome stood as the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Roman roads connected 3 continents. Roman law provided a framework for commerce and governance. Roman engineering brought water to cities and built structures that still stand today. But if you lived in Rome at its height, your experience would depend entirely on which layer of society you occupied. If you were among the elite, the senatorial class, or the equestrians, you lived in unimaginable luxury. Your villa might have heated floors, running water, elaborate gardens. You dined on delicacies imported from across the empire. You owned multiple properties, including agricultural estates worked by slaves. If you were a common citizen, you lived in a crowded apartment building, an insula, that might collapse or burn down at any moment. You received free grain from the state, but little else. You worked for low wages. If you could find work at all, your children had limited prospects for advancement. And if you were a slave, you were property. Your life and labor belonged entirely to another person by the 2nd century CE. Wealth concentration in Rome had reached extraordinary levels. A small percentage of the population controlled most of the land, most of the wealth, most of the power, the middle class. Once the backbone of Roman society was disappearing. Politicians recognized this as a problem. Reformers tried to address it, the Gracchi brothers, in the late 2nd century BCE, attempted to redistribute land and limit the size of estates. Both were murdered by the elite, who saw any redistribution as theft. As inequality grew, Rome became harder to govern. The common people lost faith in the system. They became susceptible to demagogues who promised simple solutions. Political discourse became polarized, poisonous. Violence became a tool of politics. The empire survived for centuries more, but the damage was done. The social cohesion that had made Rome strong dissolved into competing factions, each fighting over a shrinking pie. When the barbarian invasions came, there was no unified will to resist. Why should a peasant fight to preserve an empire that had given him nothing but poverty? Rome's fall wasn't inevitable, but by the time the elites recognized the danger, the very inequality that benefited them had made reform impossible. They'd rigged the system so thoroughly in their favor that fixing it would require dismantling their own power. And that they would never do voluntarily. Now, let's look at a different civilization, in a different part of the world, facing the same problem. The Inca Empire in the 15th century was the largest empire in the Americas. It stretched along the Andes for 2,500 miles, connected by a remarkable road system and administered through a sophisticated bureaucracy. The Inca developed innovative agricultural techniques, building terraces on mountainsides and creating food storage systems that protected against famine. But the Inca Empire was built on a rigid class system. At the top sat the Saper Inca, the emperor, considered a living god. Below him was the nobility, then administrators, then commoners who provided labor through the MITA system, a form of taxation paid in work rather than money. The system was efficient, but also brittle. It concentrated power at the very top and provided little flexibility. Commoners had no voice in governance. They couldn't rise based on merit. They performed their assigned roles or faced punishment. When Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with fewer than 200 men, he was able to topple the entire empire by capturing the Saper Inca. The rigid hierarchy that had made the empire efficient also made it vulnerable. Remove the head, and the body didn't know how to function. But here's the deeper issue. When Pizarro arrived, the Inca Empire was already weakened by civil war. Two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were fighting over succession. The rigid system had no way to peacefully resolve disputes at the top. The elite were fighting each other while the commoners, who had no stake in which emperor won, watched. Economic and political inequality hadn't just made the empire vulnerable to external threats. It had turned the elite against each other, consuming the empire from within. This pattern repeats throughout history. The Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, when multiple civilizations fell simultaneously, appears to have been triggered partly by extreme wealth concentration. The French Revolution erupted from an old regime where the aristocracy paid no taxes while the common people were crushed by them. The Russian Revolution stemmed from similar dynamics. Inequality doesn't just make people unhappy, it makes civilizations fragile. It reduces social trust. It encourages short-term thinking among the elite, who become more focused on protecting what they have than on the long-term health of the society. It creates populations who feel no loyalty to the existing system, because that system has given them no reason for loyalty. Every civilization that collapsed knew this. They had seen it happen before. Yet when it came time to choose between reform and collapse, between sharing power and losing everything, they chose collapse every time. In the 18th century, China stood as the most advanced civilization on Earth. The Qing dynasty ruled over a vast empire with sophisticated administration, remarkable engineering, and technological achievements that Europe was only beginning to match. But by the 19th century, something had changed. While Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution, China remained locked in traditional patterns. While European powers developed new military technologies, China relied on methods that had worked for centuries. While European ships explored and colonized, Chinese ships stayed in port. This wasn't because China lacked the capability to innovate. In previous centuries, Chinese inventors had created gunpowder, the compass, paper, printing, and countless other technologies. Chinese shipbuilders had constructed vessels that dwarfed European ships. The problem was political. The Qing court had become rigid, resistant to change. Confucian scholars dominated the bureaucracy, and they viewed traditional ways as inherently superior. Merchants and innovators were looked down upon. New ideas from outside were treated with suspicion. When British traders arrived demanding new terms of trade, the Qianlong Emperor responded with a letter to King George III that perfectly captured this rigidity. "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures." Within decades, this attitude had catastrophic consequences. The Opium Wars humiliated China militarily. Unequal treaties forced open Chinese ports. Foreign powers carved out spheres of influence. An empire that had considered itself the center of civilization found itself unable to defend its own territory. The tragedy is that voices within China recognized the danger. Reformers argued for modernization, for learning from foreign successes, for adapting to a changing world. But the political system was too rigid to allow meaningful change. By the time reform finally came, it was too late to prevent the collapse of the imperial system. This same dynamic had played out before. In China's own history, in the 15th century, China possessed the most advanced navy in the world. Admiral Zheng, he led massive fleets on expeditions across the Indian Ocean, reaching Africa decades before Europeans rounded the Cape. These voyages demonstrated Chinese power and brought back valuable trade and knowledge. But then, a new emperor took power. He and his advisors decided that the naval expeditions were too expensive and served no useful purpose. They halted the voyages. They destroyed the ships. They made it illegal to build ocean-going vessels in a single generation. China went from having the world's greatest navy to having almost no navy at all. This decision reshaped world history when Europeans began their age of exploration decades later. They faced no Chinese competition. The trajectory of global power shifted westward, not because Europe was inherently superior, but because China chose isolation. Why would a civilization make such a self-defeating choice? Because the political system valued stability over adaptation. Confucian scholars believed they had already figured out the best way to organize society. Innovation was suspicious. Change was dangerous. The traditional ways were always best. This attitude wasn't unique to China. It emerges in civilization after civilization at their peak. The Ottoman Empire in the 16th century was a military and cultural superpower. But as Europe industrialized, the Ottoman system remained largely unchanged. The Devshirme system of training administrators and the Tamar system of land grants had worked brilliantly in the 15th century. By the 18th century, they were obsolete, but the political structure made reform nearly impossible. Sultans who tried to modernize faced resistance from janissaries, from religious authorities, from bureaucrats who benefited from the status quo. The Spanish Empire extracted massive wealth from the Americas but failed to develop its own industries or flexible economic systems. The rigid mercantilism and focus on precious metals over productive capacity eventually left Spain economically weak despite its territorial wealth. Even democratic Athens, often held up as a model of adaptability, fell into political rigidity after losing the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. Athens had opportunities to reform its democratic system, to address the flaws that had led to strategic mistakes. Instead, the democracy became more radical, more polarized, less able to make coherent long-term decisions. Within decades, Athens had lost its independence. The pattern is clear. Successful civilizations develop systems that work brilliantly for their time. These systems become entrenched. The people who benefit from them resist change, and when the world changes, when new challenges emerge that the old systems can't handle, the civilization finds itself unable to adapt. Political rigidity isn't about stupidity or lack of information. It's about power. The existing system benefits certain groups. Those groups resist change because change threatens their position. And by the time the crisis becomes undeniable, The very rigidity that created the problem makes solving it impossible. In 285 CE, the Roman Empire was in crisis. Barbarian invasions, economic collapse, political instability. Emperor Diocletian implemented radical reforms to save the empire, including dividing it into eastern and western halves for more efficient administration. But something else was happening. Something less visible but more profound. The idea of Rome, the shared identity that had held the empire together, was fragmenting. In the early empire, being Roman meant something. It conferred rights, identity, purpose. People from Spain to Syria called themselves Romans and meant it. The empire wasn't just a political entity. It was a civilization that people believed in. By the 4th century, this was changing. The Western Empire's citizens increasingly identified as Gauls, or Britons, or with their local region rather than with Rome itself. The army was filled with barbarian foederati who fought for pay. Not for Rome, the elite retreated to their estates, caring more about their personal wealth than the empire's fate. Why fight for Rome when Rome was just a name, just a tax collector, just a source of demands rather than a shared purpose? The Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine, survived for another 1,000 years. Why? Partly better geography, better resources, but also because Byzantium maintained a sense of collective purpose. Its citizens believed they were preserving civilization, defending Christianity, continuing the Roman legacy. That belief made them willing to sacrifice, to work together, to fight against overwhelming odds. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it had been reduced to a city-state surrounded by the Ottoman Empire. It should have fallen centuries earlier. What kept it alive was that its people believed in it, not as a path to personal wealth, but as something worth preserving. This pillar, the loss of collective purpose, is the most subtle but perhaps the most important. Consider the Soviet Union. In the 1960s, it seemed unstoppable. A superpower with nuclear weapons, a vast military, and an ideology that millions believed in. By 1991, it had collapsed with barely a shot fired. What happened? The Soviet system had promised to create a workers' paradise, a more just society than capitalism could offer. For decades, enough people believed this to make tremendous sacrifices. They endured privations, accepted limitations on freedom, worked toward what they were told was a glorious future. But by the 1980s, almost no one believed anymore. The gap between the promise and the reality was too great. The elite were corrupt and cynical. The common people went through the motions but had stopped believing. When the system finally teetered, there was no will to save it. Even the Communist Party leadership didn't really fight to preserve it. The Soviet Union didn't fall because it was defeated militarily or because it ran out of resources. It fell because its citizens stopped believing in it, and once that collective purpose was gone, the entire structure collapsed. In fact, at its collapse, the USSR still possessed over 30,000 nuclear warheads and an army of nearly 4 million personnel. Yet the internal collapse of purpose rendered this hardware irrelevant. This same dynamic played out in ancient Egypt. For nearly 3,000 years, Egyptian civilization endured. Dynasties rose and fell, but Egypt continued. Why such remarkable stability? Because ancient Egyptians shared a powerful collective purpose. They believed in Ma'at, the divine order that kept chaos at bay. They believed their civilization was special. ordained by the gods, essential to cosmic balance. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was the living embodiment of this purpose, the link between the human and divine realms. This shared belief made incredible achievements possible. It made people willing to spend decades building pyramids. It created a society that valued continuity over change, that preserved knowledge and traditions across centuries. But in the late period, as Egypt fell under foreign rule, as Greek and then Roman culture influenced the elite, this collective purpose eroded. People still called themselves Egyptian, but it meant something different. It was an ethnic identity, not a civilizational mission. When Christianity spread through Egypt, it displaced the old religious framework that had given Egyptian civilization its meaning. Egypt didn't disappear, its people remained. But Egyptian civilization, that 3,000-year continuity of belief and purpose, ended, not because of conquest or economic collapse, but because people stopped believing in what made Egypt, Egypt. Every successful civilization is built on shared purpose. The Mongols believed they had a divine mandate to unite the world under Mongol rule. The Islamic caliphates believed they were spreading the true faith. The British Empire believed it was bringing civilization and progress to the world. However self-serving that belief was, when that shared purpose erodes, when people start asking, why are we doing this? And finding no good answer, the civilization becomes hollow. It may continue for a time on momentum alone, but it's already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. So here's the question that haunts me. That should haunt all of us, if the pattern is so clear. If history provides such obvious warnings, why don't civilizations learn? Why do we keep making the same mistakes? The answer isn't that we are stupid. It's not that we lack information. Ancient Romans could look back at the Greeks and see what had happened. The Maya knew about earlier Mesoamerican civilizations that had collapsed. We today have all of human history to learn from. The problem is deeper than ignorance. Imagine you're a Roman senator in the 2nd century CE. You own vast estates worked by slaves. You live in extraordinary luxury. The system works beautifully for you. Now imagine someone tells you, this concentration of wealth is going to destroy the empire. We need land reform. We need to strengthen the middle class. We need to limit the size of estates. What do you hear? You hear, give up your wealth, give up your power. Sacrifice everything you've built. You're not an idiot. You've read history. You know what happened to previous empires. But that's abstract. The threat to your personal position is immediate and concrete. And here's the thing. You're probably right that if you personally make sacrifices, it won't save the empire. Because everyone else needs to make sacrifices too. And if they don't, if you're the only one giving up wealth and power, you've just made yourself weaker while solving nothing. This is the tragedy of collective action problems. Even when everyone knows what needs to be done, individual incentives push in the opposite direction. A Maya king knows that deforestation is a problem, but the neighboring city is building bigger pyramids, showing more power. If he stops building to conserve resources, he looks weak, his city loses prestige, maybe another city conquers him. So he keeps building, and so does everyone else. And the forest disappears. A Chinese bureaucrat in the Qing dynasty knows that the empire needs to modernize. But modernization threatens the examination system that gave him his position. It threatens the traditional ways that he spent his life mastering. It might benefit China, but it definitely hurts him. So he resists. This is why knowledge isn't enough. The people making decisions often know what the right choice is. But the right choice for the civilization conflicts with the right choice for them personally. And people, even good people, usually choose themselves. Here's another factor. The timescale of collapse doesn't match the timescale of human decision-making. Environmental degradation takes generations. The farmer who clears one more field doesn't see the empire-wide consequences. The emperor who prioritizes military spending over education doesn't see how this weakens the civilization 3 generations later. We are very good at understanding immediate cause and effect. Plant a seed, harvest a crop, start a war, win or lose territory. But we are terrible at understanding slow, systemic changes that play out over decades or centuries. The Rapa Nui who cut down the last tree on Easter Island probably didn't think, "I'm ending our civilization." They thought, "I need firewood today." Each individual decision was rational. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. This is made worse by the fact that problems often seem to fix themselves in the short term. Rome's wealth inequality didn't immediately cause collapse. For centuries, it seemed fine. Maybe there were more beggars, more social tensions. But the empire kept functioning. Until suddenly it didn't. In Rome, by the 4th century, the top 0.1% of the population is estimated to have owned roughly 80% of the usable land. A disparity that took 3 centuries to reach its breaking point. The Maya could survive droughts as long as they had forests to buffer the climate and rich soil to farm. As those disappeared, droughts became more severe, but slowly. Each year was just slightly worse than the last, until you cross a threshold and the whole system collapses. By the time the crisis is obvious to everyone, you're already past the point where you can fix it. There's another cruel irony. Civilizations are often most vulnerable at their peak. When Rome was at its greatest extent, when its legions were unmatched, when its wealth seemed inexhaustible, that's when the seeds of collapse were being planted, because success breeds complacency. It breeds the belief that what worked before will always work. It breeds rigidity. The Maya built their largest pyramids just before the civilization collapsed. The Inca Empire reached its greatest extent in the decades before Pizarro arrived. The Soviet Union seemed most powerful in the years before it began to crumble. Success creates pressure to keep doing whatever brought success, even when circumstances have changed. The general who won the last war fights the next war the same way. The economic policy that brought growth is kept even when conditions have shifted. And questioning success feels dangerous when things are going well. People who warn about hidden problems are dismissed as alarmists, as pessimists, as people who don't appreciate how good things are. The time to reform is when you're strong, when you have resources and flexibility. But that's exactly when reform seems least necessary. Why fix what isn't broken? Why take risks when everything is going well? So civilizations wait. They wait until the problems are undeniable. And by then, they're too weak to fix them. Here's perhaps the deepest issue. As civilizations grow more successful, they grow more complex, more rules, more institutions, more interdependencies, more moving parts. This complexity is often necessary. A small tribe can operate on informal relationships and simple rules. An empire of millions needs elaborate systems, but complexity creates fragility. The more complex a system, the more ways it can fail. And the harder it is to understand what's going wrong until it's too late. When the Maya civilization was collapsing, They didn't understand why. They could see the symptoms: droughts, failing crops, political instability, but the underlying causes, the way their agricultural practices had altered regional climate patterns, the way population growth had outstripped sustainable resource use. These were invisible to them. The system was too complex to diagnose. We see this throughout history. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE remains mysterious because the interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean had created a system so complex that when it started failing, no one could figure out why or how to fix it. The Soviet Union's leadership couldn't figure out why their economy was stagnating despite enormous investment. The system was too complex, too riddled with perverse incentives and hidden feedback loops. By the time they understood the problems, the solutions would have required dismantling the entire structure. Complexity also makes reform harder. Change one part of a complex system, and you might break something else in unexpected ways. So people become cautious about change, even necessary change. Better to muddle along with problems you understand than risk making things worse. Let me take you to a place where you can see these patterns written in stone. In the jungles of Guatemala stands the ruins of a city called Tikal. At its peak around 700 CE, perhaps 100,000 people lived here. Massive pyramids rise above the jungle canopy. Intricate carvings record the deeds of kings. It's magnificent, but walk through the ruins, and you can read the story of collapse. The earliest temples are elegant, proportional, built to last. The later temples are larger, more elaborate, but also more hastily constructed. The craftsmanship declines even as the ambition grows. You find evidence of deforestation in widening circles around the city. You find signs that water became scarce, requiring more elaborate reservoir systems. You find evidence of increasing violence in skeletal remains. And here's what's haunting. You find evidence that the elite, the rulers of Tikal, knew they had problems. Inscriptions become more desperate, more focused on supernatural solutions. They performed more elaborate ceremonies. They built more temples to the gods. They did everything except address the underlying issues of unsustainable growth and resource depletion, because addressing those issues would have meant dismantling the power structure that benefited them. It would have meant admitting that the whole system they'd built was fundamentally flawed. So instead, they built bigger temples and told themselves the gods would provide. Until the gods didn't, until the city was abandoned. Swallowed by the jungle, forgotten. You can see this same pattern at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The magnificent temple complex represents the peak of Khmer civilization, but it also represents the problem. The resources devoted to building and maintaining these massive structures. The environmental damage from the elaborate hydraulic systems. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the god kings. All of this made the civilization more fragile, not stronger. When problems came, droughts and invasions and internal strife, the magnificent temples provided no help. They were monuments to power that no longer existed, built at the cost of the very resilience the civilization needed to survive. At Chaca Canyon in New Mexico, you can trace the ancestral Puebloans' increasing desperation in the archaeological record. They built larger and larger great houses, ceremonial structures that required massive inputs of timber from increasingly distant forests. The society became more hierarchical, more focused on ritual and display. And then, around 1150 CE, they left. The great houses were abandoned. A civilization that had flourished for centuries simply walked away from everything they'd built. We don't know exactly why, but we can see in the archaeological evidence the same patterns: environmental degradation, increasing social stratification, political rigidity expressed in ever more elaborate religious ceremonies. The same story, told in stone and pottery and pollen records. What's remarkable about archaeology is how clearly it reveals patterns that must have been opaque to the people living through them. A Maya farmer didn't see the deforestation of the entire region. A Roman citizen didn't perceive the slow erosion of social cohesion over generations. But we can see it, we can trace it. We can watch civilizations making the same mistakes with such consistency that it seems almost scripted. And yet, we keep performing the same script. But here's the thing, not every civilization collapses. Some adapt, some survive, some transform rather than disappear. And understanding why might be the key to breaking the pattern. In 1603, Japan was emerging from centuries of civil war. The country was devastated, politically fragmented, and vulnerable. The new Tokugawa shogunate faced a choice: continue the chaos or find a new path. What they created was radical. They largely sealed Japan off from the outside world. Severely limiting foreign contact, they froze the social hierarchy, preventing mobility but also preventing the destabilizing competition for power. They carefully managed resources, particularly forests, understanding that Japan's limited land required sustainable practices. For over 250 years, Tokugawa Japan remained stable. Some call this stagnation. But it's also a remarkable achievement. While Europe was caught up in constant warfare, revolutions, and colonial expansion, Japan maintained peace and gradually recovered from centuries of conflict. More importantly, when Commodore Perry arrived in 1853 and forced Japan to open to the world, Japanese society was able to rapidly transform. Within 50 years, Japan had industrialized, modernized its military, and become a major power. The long period of stability had created the resources and social cohesion needed for rapid adaptation. Tokugawa Japan succeeded because it recognized its vulnerabilities and addressed them systematically. It made choices that prioritized long-term stability over short-term growth. It maintained flexibility in its institutions even while appearing rigid. Denmark lost a catastrophic war with Prussia. It lost a third of its territory and population. The defeat was so total that many Europeans expected Denmark to fade into irrelevance. Instead, Denmark underwent a remarkable transformation. Political leaders and intellectuals asked hard questions about what had gone wrong. They concluded that Denmark had been clinging to outdated dreams of military power and had neglected its real strengths over the following decades. Denmark reinvented itself. It focused on education, creating folk high schools that taught practical skills and fostered civic engagement. It developed cooperative movements that spread wealth more evenly and gave rural communities economic resilience. It invested heavily in agriculture, making Danish dairy and meat products world-renowned. By the early 20th century, Denmark had become prosperous and stable. Despite being a small nation surrounded by powerful neighbors, it had survived by adapting, by recognizing that the old ways didn't work anymore, and by having the political will to change. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, the eastern half continued. Historians call it the Byzantine Empire, but its people called themselves Romans. and they remained Romans for another 1,000 years. How did they survive when the West collapsed? Partly geography and resources. Constantinople's location made it easier to defend and gave it access to wealthy trade routes. But other factors mattered more. Byzantium maintained flexibility in its institutions. Unlike the rigid Western administration, Byzantine emperors could adapt policies to circumstances. They were pragmatic. When they faced threats they couldn't defeat militarily, they used diplomacy, bribery, playing enemies against each other. Byzantium also maintained a genuine civic identity, even in its final centuries. When the empire had shrunk to little more than Constantinople itself, its citizens believed they were defending something important. They weren't fighting for an emperor's personal power. They were fighting for a civilization they genuinely valued. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, it had outlasted the Western Empire by 1,000 years. It survived that long not because it was unchanging, but because it was able to change. What do these exceptions have in common? First, they recognized their vulnerabilities. They didn't pretend problems didn't exist or assume success was permanent. They looked clearly at their weaknesses and addressed them. Second, they maintained social cohesion. Tokugawa Japan, Denmark, and Byzantium all had strong civic identities that gave people reasons to work together, to make sacrifices for the collective good. Third, they adapted their institutions. They didn't cling rigidly to systems just because those systems had worked in the past. When circumstances changed, they changed. Fourth, they thought long-term. They were willing to make choices that didn't maximize short-term gain but provided long-term stability. Tokugawa Japan's forest management, Denmark's investment in education, Byzantium's diplomatic flexibility. Fifth, they addressed inequality before it became destabilizing. None of these societies were egalitarian, but they avoided the extreme wealth concentration that destroyed other civilizations. These aren't easy things to do. They require political will, social trust, and often a willingness to accept limitations, but they work. And they're the only things that have consistently worked, which brings us to now, to us, to the civilization we are building or failing to build. We know more than any previous civilization. We can study the Maya, the Romans, the Easter Islanders. We can see exactly what went wrong. We have the data, the analysis, the understanding, and yet, here we are, facing the same four pillars of collapse: environmental degradation on a global scale, climate change altering weather patterns, deforestation, soil depletion, water scarcity, biodiversity loss. We know what we are doing. We have the data. We continue anyway. Economic inequality reaching levels not seen in a century. Wealth concentrating in fewer hands while the middle class shrinks. We know this destabilizes societies. We know how this story ends. We continue anyway. Political rigidity and polarization, systems designed for the 18th century being applied to 21st century problems. Inability to reform institutions even when their failures are obvious. We know this makes civilizations brittle. We continue anyway, and perhaps most worrying, a loss of shared purpose. Increasing numbers of people, particularly in developed nations, don't believe their society is building toward anything meaningful. They see the system as serving the wealthy and powerful, not as something worth preserving or working for. The pattern is unmistakable. We are following the same script that so many civilizations followed before us. But here's the thing. Here's what makes this moment different from all those previous civilizations. We know, we can see the pattern. We understand what's happening. Does that matter? Or is knowledge not enough? There's an argument for optimism. Previous civilizations faced their challenges in isolation. The Maya couldn't call the Romans for advice. The Khmer couldn't study what happened to the ancestral Pueblones. We can. We are interconnected globally. We can share knowledge, coordinate responses, learn from each other's mistakes in real time. We have technologies that previous civilizations couldn't imagine. We have systems of communication and cooperation that could, potentially, allow us to overcome the collective action problems that destroyed earlier societies. We've already dodged some bullets. The hole in the ozone layer was a global environmental crisis. We recognized it, coordinated an international response, and fixed it. Nuclear war seemed inevitable during the Cold War. We've avoided it so far. Global poverty, while still too high, has decreased dramatically over the past 50 years. Maybe, just maybe, we can be the generation that breaks the pattern, that learns from history instead of repeating it, but there's a counter-argument, that all our knowledge, all our technology, all our interconnection doesn't change the fundamental dynamics. The perverse incentives still exist. The wealthy and powerful still resist changes that would reduce their wealth and power. The short term still dominates decision-making over the long term. Our political systems still struggle to address slow-moving, complex crises, and our very success. Our global civilization, our technological prowess, might make us more vulnerable, not less. We are more complex than any previous civilization, which means more ways to fail. We are more interconnected, which means failures cascade faster and farther. We've created systems we can barely understand, let alone control. We might simply be repeating the pattern on a larger scale. With more at stake, the honest answer is, we don't know yet. We are living through a test. The same test that the Maya faced, that Rome faced, that every civilization eventually faces. The test of whether a society can overcome short-term incentives for long-term survival. Whether it can maintain cohesion in the face of challenges. Whether it can adapt its institutions when circumstances change. Some civilizations passed this test, most didn't. We won't know which category we fall into for decades, maybe centuries. The collapse of civilizations happened slowly. Then suddenly, right now, we are in the slowly phase. Things seem manageable, problems exist, but the system keeps functioning. The question is whether we'll use this time to change course, or whether we'll keep building bigger pyramids while the forest disappears around us. Stand in the ruins of any great civilization, and you feel it, the weight of all that lost knowledge, lost potential, lost possibility. The Maya developed sophisticated mathematics and astronomy, and then forgot it. The Library of Alexandria contained treatises on science and philosophy we'll never recover. The fall of Rome plunged Europe into centuries of reduced knowledge and capability. Every time a civilization collapses, humanity loses something precious, not just buildings and artifacts, but knowledge, social technologies, ways of organizing ourselves that took centuries to develop. But here's what I've come to understand, standing in those ruins, reading the archaeological reports, studying the patterns. Those civilizations didn't fail because they were stupid. They failed because they were human, because they faced the same challenges we face. the conflict between individual incentives and collective good, the difficulty of long-term thinking, the rigidity that comes with success, the erosion of shared purpose. They failed because the problems are genuinely hard, and knowing about them doesn't automatically solve them. But knowledge is something, it's not nothing. When the last emperor of Rome saw the empire crumbling, he didn't understand why. When the last Maya king abandoned his city, he couldn't see the larger pattern. When Easter Island's trees were nearly gone, the Rapa Nui didn't realize they had crossed a point of no return. We can see these things. We understand the mechanisms. We know what we are risking. That knowledge doesn't guarantee we'll make different choices, but it gives us the possibility of making different choices. And that's more than any previous civilization had. The story of human civilization is, in many ways, the story of repeating the same mistakes, but it's also the story of slowly, incrementally, learning, of some societies figuring out how to survive, of knowledge accumulating across the collapse of empires. We are the inheritors of all those civilizations, the ones that failed and the ones that survived. Their mistakes and their successes are written in the archaeological record, preserved in the historical texts, encoded in the ruins that dot the earth. The question is, will we read that inheritance? Will we learn from it? Or will we become just another layer of ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over? I don't know the answer, but I know that asking the question matters. That understanding the pattern matters, that remembering the civilizations that came before us, the forgotten earths that lie buried beneath our feet, matters, because maybe, just maybe, the way we break the cycle is by refusing to forget, by keeping the memory of all those fallen civilizations alive, by making their mistakes vivid and real and impossible to ignore. We've seen what happens when societies believe they're exceptional, that history's lessons don't apply to them. Every civilization thought they were different. Every civilization thought they had figured out something new. Every civilization was wrong. Our only hope is to know we are not exceptional, to know we are susceptible to the same patterns, to know that without constant effort, constant adaptation, constant attention to the things that matter, we'll follow the same path. The ruins of past civilizations aren't just monuments to what was lost. They're warnings about what could be lost. They're reminders that nothing is permanent, that success is temporary, that civilization is fragile. But they're also proof that humans are capable of extraordinary things, that we can build, create, achieve, organize ourselves in ways that last for centuries, that we can pass knowledge down through generations, that we can learn, even if the learning comes slowly. The Maya are gone, Rome is gone, Easter Island civilization is gone, but we remember them, we've learned from them. Their failures teach us, their successes inspire us. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the cycle can be broken, not through some dramatic transformation, but through the slow, difficult work of applying the lessons that history has taught us. Or maybe we are just another civilization telling ourselves comforting stories while we walk toward the same ending that claimed all the others. Either way, we'll find out. The pattern is clear. The warning is given. The choice, as always, is ours. This is Forgotten Earth, reminding you that the best way to predict the future is to study the past, and the best way to avoid becoming history is to remember it.